This podcast is powered by the Digital SME Alliance. The Digital SME Summit lands at the European Economic and Social Committee in Brussels on December 10th. The all-day event will highlight topics on AI, sustainability, standardization, digital skills, and more. For tech companies, a unique matchmaking session awaits you to connect, network, and partner with peer European innovators.
Today in the EU, Draghi report, competitiveness, and EU corporate reporting requirements facing backlash. European businesses are increasingly concerned about the EU's growing regulatory and reporting requirements, which they say hamper competitiveness and productivity. The combination of high energy prices, well above those in the US, and stringent sustainability and compliance requirements is putting pressure on several industries and small and medium-sized enterprises in particular. While the European Union aims to reduce reporting obligations by 25%, the challenge is to balance simplification with maintaining the core objectives of its laws, such as climate and human rights standards. These concerns echo key findings of the Draghi report, which highlighted the EU's struggles with productivity and global competition. Hello and welcome. I am Evi Kiorri, and this is Today in the EU. To dig deeper, I am joined by our Berlin-based economy reporter, Jonathan Packroff. Jonathan, there is a lot to talk about how the EU wants to be more competitive, which has been one of the main pillars of the famous now Draghi report. Where does this leave Europe? What is the plan?
Yeah, so as you rightly said, the Draghi report has really shaped the agenda also for the now soon to be sworn new commission.
My concern is not that we'll suddenly find ourselves poor and subservient to others. It is that over time, we will inexorably become less prosperous, less equal, less secure, and as a result, less free to choose our destiny.
Expect the Commission to really prioritize this issue of European competitiveness. And then already in the Draghi report, we saw a lot of comparison with the United States. So essentially, Draghi, for instance, noted that since 2000, disposable income of households in Europe has grown only by half of what it has grown in the US. So essentially, US citizens became richer, became more wealthy or had higher income now at a very quicker rate than this is happening in the EU, which has obviously multiple reasons. But one of them is, as Draghi lays out, the problem that Europe lacks productivity growth, whereas the US has actually quite some productive new tech sectors, for instance, very successful industries.
Right. Another important talk in town, both in Berlin, where you're reporting from, but also here in Brussels, is the fact that Angela Merkel's biography is coming out today, and competitiveness was also on her agenda, maybe in a different way or in a different shape even, but it was there. And how successful it was, time has shown. Can you tell us more on this?
Yeah, so by Tuesday, this book will be out. But already in advance, Merkel had a lot of interviews and some parts were already published. And what she said in an interview with Der Spiegel, the German magazine, was that actually she defended kind of her legacy on this Nord Stream project and her policy towards Russia, if you want, because that is often criticized, essentially, that during her 16 years of office, she has increasingly let Germany be in a situation where it's quite energy dependent on Russia. At the end point, 60% of all gas imports came from Russia. So that was quite a lot. And she essentially said she saw it as her task to secure cheap gas for the German economy, most notably, of course, for the industries, for energy-intensive industries, which Germany has quite a lot. Think about the chemical industry, for instance. And essentially, she turned the criticism around by saying, now that the Russian gas is not there anymore, we see actually what impact high energy prices have on the European economy, or specifically on the German economy. And we indeed see that. I mean, Germany has not grown for 2 years. It's in the second year of recession now. And also for previous years, it didn't really perform well. So essentially, we really see that Germany is struggling now that the energy prices are so much higher. And this is, again, to come back to Draghi, This is one of the other key phenomenons, apart from the lack of maybe a tech industry, is that actually energy prices in Europe are 2 to 3 times higher than in the US. And specifically for gas, it's 4 to 5 times.
And what steps is the European Commission taking to reduce regulatory burdens, including reporting requirements across the EU?
Maybe also to take one step back there is that, of course, another thing that differentiates Europe from the US is, of course, this approach to regulation. So essentially, there was now a joint statement by three large business groups in Europe, the German BDI, the French MEDEF, and Italian Confindustria, and they note that essentially the EU had double amount of laws compared to the US. So essentially, you had a lot of regulation in Europe over the last years, and in particular, of course, over the last 5 years of the first term of Ursula von der Leyen, because, of course, you had all this Green Deal, you had a lot of environmental and sustainability regulation. And these things are now very thoroughly scrutinized, and a lot of industries or businesses question them and say it's actually too much to some extent. And then the promise of Ursula von der Leyen and of other politicians is we can reduce the burden that you have. For instance, the paperwork, the so-called reporting obligations, we can reduce that by 25%. That's a promise that Ursula von der Leyen gave, without actually touching the essence of these laws.
If confirmed as Executive Vice President for a clean, just and competitive transition, I'm committed to support the objectives set out by the President von der Leyen, going faster in advancing sustainable prosperity and competitiveness, making business easier by reducing the administrative burdens. I will do so by both coordinating the Green Agenda with my fellow colleagues in the Commission and enforcing a competition policy based on our democratic values to support a well-functioning single market.
And as we heard, reducing the legislative burden is also something that the upcoming Commissioner for the Clean, Just and Competitive Transition, Teresa Ribeira, highlighted in her confirmation hearing 2 weeks ago as one of her core missions to bolster European competitiveness.
So we want to stick to for instance, the climate targets, also the sustainability targets, for instance, supply chain due diligence. That means you have to check kind of that your suppliers are adhering to human rights and certain environmental standards. So essentially, they want to keep the aim of the law, but reduce the reporting obligations. And that is the very difficult and very thorny task that will come, because, of course, then these businesses see this as an opportunity to also roll back on substance some of these things. So this will be really dominating the weeks and months ahead of us.
What are the key regulatory challenges or directives under scrutiny, and why are they so controversial?
One thing why they are controversial is, of course, because of the actual paperwork that you have to fill out, all these different questionnaires and so on. But then it's also a question of the approach, because a lot of things that the EU did over the last years were actually meant to have a global impact. And that is a pattern that you saw over many different legislations. If you think about not only the supply chain due diligence law, but also the anti-deforestation regulation that now has been delayed, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, so essentially a carbon border tax where you have to pay a price for CO2 if you import something to Europe. And all these things try to kind of bring other countries to follow similar rules or similar standards as the EU does. And this, of course, makes it difficult for businesses in global trade, because they are essentially, then they have to ask a lot of suppliers, please fill out this questionnaire before we can make business with you. Please fill out this and this, or please, make sure that you know what your carbon footprint is and all these things. So essentially, this also hampers the trade, the global trade of EU businesses. And they say, look, these companies, they also have alternatives now in the world. They can trade with China, they can trade with the US, and, they will just buy their products without questions. And Europeans always come and ask questions, and they have to fill out questionnaires. So I think, it has also to do with the fact that Europe thought it could use its strength as a demand market on the global level. But now it is falling behind. It is falling, it is not performing as good as before. So the question is, can it still maintain this role of trying to push other countries to follow its rules as well?
Jonathan, how are businesses and stakeholders responding to the Commission's efforts to simplify regulations?
Yeah, as I already said, there was this joint statement by three business groups, and essentially not really surprising if you read the Draghi report or listened to the podcast episodes about it. They call for a reduction in energy prices, a reduction in bureaucracy, an increase in R&D, so research and development spending. and also an integration of capital markets. So these are really things that, of course, have been around for a while, but they now say we need to get serious about this. We need to fasten this up. And this is something that these businesses care about. But as I said, I mean, this sounds much easier than it's done, because it's a very difficult task in all of these areas.
Right. And what political and economic pressures are influencing the Commission's approach to regulatory simplification?
Yeah, so I think the biggest impact on the Commission agenda was really the Draghi report itself. So essentially, of course, this was requested by the Commission as well to have to lay out certain necessary steps for the next years. And what the kind of lobbyism watchdog Corporate Europe Observatory says is that actually it was businesses themselves that then in turn influenced Draghi a lot when he was drafting the report. So essentially they analyzed the contributions that Draghi got ahead of the report, and they found out that 65% of these kind of letters and meetings and statements that he received when writing this report actually came from kind of business lobby groups. And this is also what they say is really, then you can find this really in the report, that this is actually a lot of the demands that these specific industries have as well. Because if you look at there's a part B, which is, I think, 300 pages full of very detailed policy proposals. And they say these actually look quite similar to what key industries want.
How does the Commission plan to balance simplification with maintaining essential regulatory standards, particularly in environmental and social areas?
This is exactly the most complicated task, of course. As I mentioned, there is this promise to reduce reporting obligations by 25%, and for small and medium-sized companies, it's 35%. And then there was a question by a parliamentarian from the European Parliament, but what are the costs right now? What are the obligations that you want to reduce by 25%? Like, what is the 100%? And the Commission was unable to say that because they don't have an overview over what are actually all the different reporting obligations that are caused by different EU laws. So what they are doing now is kind of, they call it a stress test. So it's essentially they look into each and every law of the EU since like the 1970s and look where does it oblige someone to create a report, some form of report. And then this is very difficult because a lot of these things are directives as well. So they are implemented then by member states. And sometimes the member states then oblige reports. Or think about the green finance taxonomy, which essentially is a rule book or a handbook for banks, which says these and these activities are sustainable. But then the banks, in order to be able to make that assessment, they will ask the people that they are lending to do a report. So then these companies also have to report to their bank. Then a lot of, think about the supply chain due diligence law, which essentially requires large companies to check whether there is sustainability in their supply chains and human rights standards in their supply chains. So they will ask their suppliers for that. So then if you supply something to a big company that has to report this, then you will be asked by this company to report to this company. So these, especially that is what the industry or business representative says. These businesses are faced with so many different reporting obligations to so many different kind of groups that they are essentially, it's simply too much. They are spending too much effort on this. They have to hire new people, or the CEO has to do it themselves in smaller, if you think about smaller firms. And in that time, they cannot reach out to new kind of business opportunities or, try to find new clients or whatsoever. So this is what they say is actually straining them. And this is what makes it very complicated.
Thank you very much, Jonathan.
Thank you.
I am Evi Kiorri, and this was my very last episode for the Today in the EU podcast. I would like to take a moment to thank all of you who followed us from the start, but also all of you who joined along the way and made this podcast a part of your daily routine. Keep listening to the Today in the EU. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time.